Good evening. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and for being here and to be here in person. We really appreciate it. So on behalf of the German department at NYU and Deutsches Haus, I'm Uli Bär, I'm university professor at NYU. And it is really an honor and a pleasure to introduce today's ULFERS Foundation Award winner. So thank you, Juliana, first of all, for hosting this from Deutsches Haus. Thank you, Elizabeth, for German department support of this event, and to all of you for coming here. It is an honor and a pleasure, as I said, to introduce this year's honoree, Daniel Kehlmann, who's sitting here in front of me. And before I introduce Daniel, I would like to say something about the ULFERS Award. The ULFERS Foundation Award is presented annually by the NYU German department to individuals who contribute to disseminate, to make more available, to make more accessible, or to estrange us from German culture and history. The past recipients have included the director Margarete von Trotta, the scholar, curator, and archivist Barton Big, and others. And I would just like to acknowledge the generosity and the visionary leadership of my longtime colleague and friend, Professor Fred ULFERS, right here in the front. It is also today Fred's birthday, but I think we should start by giving So as much as we're celebrating Daniel Kehlmann tonight, and I will say something about Daniel in a minute, we are also recognizing, as I said, the generosity and the visionary leadership of Fred in his longtime engagement at NYU. And I'll say a few words about that, if I may, Fred. Fred arrived in this country, emigrating from Germany in 1951 with his parents. He settled in the Bronx, where he still lives today. So he came not only to America, but to New York City. And there's a slight difference in that. He became a lifelong resident there and started studying then at City College of New York, where he switched ultimately from his initial major in accounting, thankfully, to literature, after a conversation with his college counselor. I think that conversation was transformative and important, and Fred's career has been actually dedicated and devoted to the advisement and counseling and listening to students for over 60 years now. In 1962, Professor ULFERS started teaching in the German department and then German literature, philosophy, history, and culture. At NYU, he was promoted quickly to assistant and associate professor, and also assumed the role of assistant dean, in which he served for many years. He's also been the director of the Presidential Scholars Program, a key advisor to the Collegiate Honors Program, and the director of NYU's Summer in Berlin program for several years. At one point, in the not too distant past, he was also director of Deutsches Haus at NYU, right here. And I name these titles not to give you a list of administrative functions, but because the impact and legacy of Fred's role at the university goes far beyond this room and far beyond those appointments. Over the past 60 years, and with unflagging enthusiasm and commitment that all of his colleagues have witnessed firsthand, Fred has been not only a mainstay in the German department, but a transformative teacher on the undergraduate and graduate levels in NYU's core curriculum and the Freshman Honors Seminars program. He has been recognized with the Distinguished Teaching Award, the University Heights College Faculty Hall of Fame Award, the Great Teacher Award, and twice the Golden Dozen Award for Teaching Excellence. I'd like to point out that this last award is actually nominated and decided upon by students and not people like me. His research on Nietzsche has been published nationally, internationally, and I think it is correct to say that his impact as a teacher is now spread all over the world through the commitment, enthusiasm, and thoughtfulness of his students. It is not an uncommon experience, and I've shared this with Fred before, as has happened to me several times, once while entering the US at JFK Airport, and a senior customs official said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I teach at a university." "Which one?" "NYU." He said, "Do you know Fred ULFERS?" With a hushed tone that immediately flipped into incredible enthusiasm and brought that person to life in a way and said, "This was the most important moment in my life so far." And it got me through customs, which is always good. But I also have met people who worked in the medical establishment and hospitals who studied Nietzsche or Kafka with Fred, and it touched them in a way. Fred's presence at NYU has been one of remarkable generosity and a visionary commitment to the study of German literature and culture. It is therefore a great honor to recognize today this year's recipient of the ULFERS Foundation Award. Daniel Kehlmann is known to all of you, or most of you, as a writer of remarkable range and erudition, whose novels, short stories, plays, film scripts, dramatic dialogues, essays, and lectures have mesmerized the reading and viewing public in countless countries. To us at NYU, he's been known, of course, as a colleague, as the former Barron visiting professor, and a frequent guest at lectures, workshops, conferences, and events, and as a friend. Daniel was born in Munich and spent formative years in Vienna. Today he makes his home in Berlin and in New York. The author of over 13 books, several plays, and a good number of film scripts, his novel Measuring the World has been translated into dozens of languages, and his novel Tyll, set in the 30-Year War as the study of an outsider who becomes both an actor of and a witness to history, is being turned into a Netflix series. And we talked about this recently, how that is the mark of acclaim these days, when it used to be a Hollywood contract. His plays have been performed in London's West End and other places, and he's written treatments for films with leading directors. He's received numerous awards, including the Candide Prize, the Grand Prix du Livre des Dirigeants, the Thomas Mann Prize, the Prix du Roman Européen, the Friedrich Hölderlin Prize, and recently the Elisabeth Langeser Literatur Prize, among others. They say that for beginning writers and also established writers, it is always good to follow the advice, write what you know. I think it might be correct to say that thankfully, Daniel Kehlmann has not followed this advice. For how could anybody know so many different things about so many different areas of life? And how could somebody write contemporary novels set in the distant historical past, not quite historical novels, in a way that does not turn them into historical novels, but into gripping tales that use their historical context, not as backdrop, but as a realm which comes to life in our present alongside the characters. Daniel sets himself strange and outlandish goals by setting his novels in places and times where one misstep, one erroneous fact could bring the whole edifice down. But instead of weighing down his books with this enormous knowledge and erudition and expertise that he has in his head, Daniel has the gift of gentle irony, of a light touch, and a way of presenting his characters in a way that makes them appear new with every turn of the page. Whether it's South America, the German provinces, the 30 Years' War, a haunted country house, or the art and media worlds, Daniel brings this unusual mixture of great intelligence and what my late teacher, Jeffrey Hartman, once called the innocence of an unmediated vision to his works. When I reread his runaway success, Measuring the World, in preparation for tonight, I thought about that book as perhaps paradigmatic of what literature always tries to do. That novel's two main characters, a mathematician and an explorer in 19th century Germany, undertake an effort to take stock of and measure the world as it is being built and constructed and reconceived in the early 19th century, just before the rise of technology and machines. One of the characters is interested in measuring what is right in front of us, but what human perception tends to overlook because we're simply not focused enough to understand the place where we already are. The other one ventures out into far-flung places and tries to map and inventory, categorize, and catalog everything that is as far away from his hometown as possible. Daniel's work draws its strength from what he calls, at some point in that book, the unrest at the heart of nature. And I think this is a central place, which is actually a place that's not a place in his book. And I'll read you a sentence in German, so bear with me. Relax, it's German. Würde jetzt irgendwann die Unruhe im Herzen der Natur verstehen. Man brauchte nicht auf Berge zu klettern oder sich durch den Dschungel zu quälen. Wer diese Nadel beobachtete, sah ins Innere der Welt. Daniel's work gets us close to this unrest at the heart of nature, at the place from which these two people set out. One is centrifugal, moving out, the other centripetal, moving in. One moves us away from ourselves, moves us also away from the idea of a national tradition of German literature, and the other moves us inward, inviting us to pay closer attention to what is right in front of us and even inside of us. In his other works, these tendencies are differently portrayed, and I could explain that, but that would take too long. For those familiar with the great German traditions of thought, not always properly called German, but grouped like that in this country. These two movements are perhaps not entirely, these two movements in Daniel's novel, to go out and to go in, to discover the disquiet at the heart of the world, are perhaps not entirely unlike the non-dialectical two movements in the writings of Hölderlin, where the greatest inwardness is achieved only by the ecstatic flinging oneself out into the universe, and where the most German of writing is found by reading the most ancient Greek. We find the same tension, also unresolved, between the Dionysian drive toward formlessness and destruction and the Apollonian drive for creation and forming things in Nietzsche. But here I should defer to Fred, who explained and had this discussion with me maybe 25 years ago when I arrived at NYU about the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which is not a dialectical resolution, there's no synthesis. And we find this unrest perhaps also in the works of Sigmund Freud, another writer who moved to Vienna at a young age, like Daniel, and who locates us in the irreconcilable tension between two only apparently opposing drives. The strength of Daniel's work results from his ability to keep us suspended in this slight unrest at the heart of the world, without letting this unrest turn into full-on chaos. Now, I suspect, just from my personal friendship with Daniel, that writing for Daniel, as it was for Hölderlin, for Nietzsche, for Freud, and for others, is also a way to keep the chaos at bay. He keeps us suspended there thanks to the light touch of his language, his subtle irony, and his delight in both knowing and understanding things. And the amount of research that you do for your books is really just awe-inspiring. But the delight in both knowing and understanding things, but never ceasing to just marvel at that which we just cannot understand. He often performs what Hölderlin called once Wechsel der Töne, a switch in perspective, tonality, genre, pacing, and diction that carries its own significance, rather than just being merely the empty break between two different modes. He is like the character in Measuring the World, and I was talking to my friend Eyal Peretz last night, and he said, oh, Daniel, he's an explorer. So there's an explorer of the self and of the world, an explorer of the wide world around us, an explorer of the mysteries inside us, also an explorer of fiction. And I would be remiss not to note Daniel's truly incredible knowledge of world literature, the way he's generously shared that with students at NYU. We want to thank him for that, and his playful way of alluding to a range of great writers in subtle and sly ways in conversation and in his writings. There's no dialectical summation, no synthesis, but rather a continually self-generating energy that draws the reader in and keeps us engaged. At the end of Measuring the World, as you will remember, and I will remind Daniel, who probably has not reread his own book in many years, I presume, a younger man is kicked out of Germany to set out for the New World. The passage across the Atlantic on a steamship, which is very new at this time, marks the end of that period of the great navigators, the mappers of the world, of which Humboldt and Gauss are two examples or paragons. It is the rise of the age of machines. The poet Paul Celan, who, like Daniel and Freud, spent formative years in Vienna, once said that poetry, by which he meant genuine literature, is like a message in a bottle cast out to reach land at some point, perhaps heartland, Herzland. Celan meant that poetry and literature in general can reach not a particular cultural or geographic destination or location, but that it can reach people who are not at home in the world but can connect to others via their heart. I like to imagine that Daniel sometimes sits at his desk, dreaming up a new story, in the hope that his book might reach heartland after he casts them out like messages in a bottle. And today, I'd like to think that thanks to the generosity of Fred ULFERS, Daniel's books arrive in New York City, in Greenwich Village, on the ancestral land of the Lenape Nation, right here in Deutsches Haus, and that they reach heartland, Herzland, here. Thank you, Daniel, for sending out your messages in bottles and letting us receive them. And I just want to take a moment and do what we do on Broadway and applaud once more Fred ULFERS' generosity and also the fact that you're here with us and you brought us together and you brought us out for me is the first live in-person event in about 2 years. So thank you, Fred. You're doing. And now I will give the space to Daniel, and I'm really thrilled and excited that Juliana and Elizabeth were able to arrange this. So Ayad Akhtar, who's sitting over there, is going to join us now in a conversation with Daniel. He's a novelist and playwright, of course, known to probably most of you, if not, It's High Time, a Pulitzer Prize winner for drama, the author of Homeland Elegies and Disgraced and American Dervish. I just mixed up genres, so there are 2 novels and a play. And I really want to thank you, Ayad, for having a conversation with Daniel. Enjoy this. We'll go on for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then Fred will say something about the ULFERS Foundation Award. Thank you so much, Daniel, and congratulations.
Thanks for having me. My first time at Deutsches Haus. Daniel's a close friend. I probably spend more time texting Daniel than doing most other things in my life. So, which I have a feeling you do that with a lot of people. I don't know where you find the time to do all the work you do and to maintain the social engagements that you do as well.
Not as many people as you might think. Okay. Really not. No, it's not. You might be on the top of the list, but I know how much you work, so I always feel like, can I really send him a message now? So you would get more if I wouldn't be in awe of the amount of work that you do.
That's unnecessary. Thank you, Daniel. I have this list of questions that I spent a bunch of days rereading your work. I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm a huge fan of you. I think I've often described you as, you are a savant, I think. You have this capacity, endless capacity for wonder that is unfeigned. You have a curiosity that's insatiable. You have a storehouse of knowledge, granular knowledge about so many different things, and a kind of sophistication of your understanding of where literary culture intersects with contemporary reality. And I find that talking to you and being in conversation with you always sharpens my experience. You're back in America, so this is how it goes in America, right? But I was intrigued. I have this list of questions, but I was intrigued by the connections that were being made about Vienna. Because I think a lot about this. You come from Vienna. I love to go to Vienna. I'm always intrigued by your take on Vienna. What can you speak to some of what was said about the different writers who spent time in Vienna as children and their contributions to German literature, and how you both see that affecting your own production and your own sensibility?
Yeah, I grew up in Vienna. I went to university in Vienna, and at the same time, I never quite belonged, which was just a language thing. My mother was and is from Germany, and Austrians are very peculiar about how you talk, about their Austrian accent, and somehow I didn't. Now I'm kind of wondering why that didn't happen, because I went to school there, but I never quite assimilated the Austrian accent. So that was a little bit difficult when I started to go to school there. Then my classmates got used to it. And then when I started publishing, first in a small Austrian publishing house, people were kind of wondering, who's this person who's not really Austrian and living here and publishing Deutsche, which is a small but prestigious Austrian publisher, which has ceased to exist, regrettably. But to give you a less personal answer, I always wanted to get out of there, get away from Vienna, be somewhere else. I felt my influences were coming from somewhere else. The writing that shaped me most came from somewhere else. And since I haven't been living in Vienna, I appreciate how important Vienna was and is for me. And I appreciate how important the Austrian literary tradition is for me. And I feel like I'm still not at the point where I want to move back there, but
You still have an apartment there.
I still have an apartment there, yeah, which is a little bit embarrassing because at this point going to a hotel would be much cheaper because I don't spend that much time there. But I still keep the connection, and it actually gets it grows on me. It becomes more and more important, and I feel the more time you spend in Germany or with German culture, the more the otherness of Austrian culture, the slightly ironic, different take on things that Austrian culture provides and Austrian literary tradition provides, becomes more and more important for you. So I'm little by little discovering in small steps how much I owe Austria.
Could you say more about the Austrian literary tradition as something that you feel shaped you more than you realized?
Yes, yes.
Can you say more about that? Can you say more about the specific, what is it specifically about the tradition?
Well, I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of the difference between Austria and Germany in terms of literary tradition. Germany, the German literature is very much shaped by Protestantism, by the culture of the Protestant priests and their sons, mostly a few daughters, writing about and exploring in great poetry, mostly their personal individual connection to God, which is the essence of Protestantism, the individual towards God. Whereas Austria is really a court culture. It's a culture shaped by many, many centuries of a center, of a powerful center and a powerful court in the center. And the court is all about irony, about social connections, about a certain kind of speech that is uneigentlich. You say something, but you mean something else, and people understand what you really mean. So there is, if you I had a conversation with Michael Haneke about Hofmannsthals Der Schwierige, and he thinks that actually this play cannot be done anymore because the people who really understood this kind of language and what it meant and what the social world means that it comes from, aristocrats who suddenly don't have a country anymore, and it makes them slightly amused and melancholic. This is so far removed from what you find in the forces that shape our world. He thinks that actors cannot do it anymore the way it has to be done, so you do something different. He wasn't pessimistic or negative about it. He just felt like we have to do other plays now and confine this to reading. And I feel like some, for example, of the irony, the ironic take on German culture that Measuring the World provides on is shaped by Austrian culture, even though Humboldt only spends one paragraph in Austria, which in itself was kind of a little in-joke I put in there. Austria is in there, but just for one paragraph. That's it.
Thanks for that. It answers a lot of questions I've had about. Want to talk about that more, but we'll do it privately. So, so my first question here is coming off Tyll. So, for those of us who don't know Tyll, could you tell us just briefly, give us a kind of simplest overlay of what Tyll is about?
It's a novel. Well, Martin Amis said famously that a novel is not about something, so I will avoid the word about. It's a novel set in the 30 Years' War, and it's a novel exploring the moment of cataclysm of European culture in the 17th century, and exploring that by using a mythical Northern European German character, Till Ullenspiegel, who originally comes from stories from the late Middle Ages, and I'm sending him as a kind of a guide for the reader to different moments in this catastrophic meltdown of civilization that happened in the first half of the 17th century.
There's you know, to echo some of the comments that were made to introduce you as well, it's a historical novel without being a traditional, I mean, it's not a historical novel, but it has get the experience of feeling as if you are living at that time as you read it. And so the evocation, this is what I wrote here, is the evocation of the 17th century in Tyll is remarkable. The details are startling, but it's really the atmosphere of thought that you capture. You know, there are sort of phenomenological details in terms of the things that people wear and do, but it's not riddled with that kind of detail. The spell of the 17th century captured in the texture of belief and its internal patterns. How did you do that?
Yeah, that's what I really wanted to write about. That was really in the center of what interested me, like the fact that the world of thought and of human feelings was so different, that people were really profoundly different, and to an extent that's hard to understand and that's still very challenging to engage with. And I was really struggling with how to work with that as a storyteller, what to do with that. And one thing that I didn't want to do was to write pastiche, write something that sounds like it could have been written in the 17th century, but it isn't, that imitates a 17th century novel. So, and then after a lot of experimenting and thinking about it, and a lot of false starts actually, what I tried to do was to have a strong narrative voice, but a voice that doesn't use any concepts, any ideas, any concepts is actually, I think is the right word, of any notions that people didn't have. So I didn't try to avoid anachronisms in terms of the language I use. That's kind of impossible, because German back then was really very, very different from the German we use. But I'm trying to avoid all notions and ideas that people wouldn't have had. And that's harder to do than you would think at first, or than I thought at first, because especially ideas of psychology and physics are deeply embedded in the way we talk and think now. So just saying something like, I'm depressed today, or I wanted to leave the house, I didn't have the energy. They didn't have the concept of energy like we do. And especially not in regular everyday thought. And so writing this was kind of a filtering process. I kept using ideas and words that then I felt like I had to take out. I had to replace by something else. I couldn't say scientist, I had to say scholar. And when characters think about the day, or how they spend the day, or when they meet, they don't even have, they never think in minutes. They barely think in hours. Minutes is not something that happens in their life. So the narrator, the narrative voice, couldn't say something like 10 minutes later he left the house, because the characters don't know minutes. So the narrative voice does not know minutes. And there were some examples. There were some words or notions where I'm not even sure. So I had the word mechanism in there. Mechanism, by some clever mechanism, something happened, and then a well-read friend of mine said, mechanism, that sounds wrong. They wouldn't have. And I was like, I'm not sure, but when in doubt, I took it out. So I did a lot of rewriting to filter everything out. There was that wouldn't have been part of how people experienced the world back then.
It's interesting because in reading the book, I thought, how the hell did he inhabit this. I mean, you're the least superstitious person I know, but your knack for the superstitious consciousness of the book is so uncanny.
It's actually right at the core of what I wanted to do. Yeah, I feel like I wanted to write about a world where you can, well, speaking about anachronism, superstition is an anachronistic way of thinking about it,
Sure.
because people back then would not have thought that you're superstitious if you think that somebody can curse you,
right,
and then you get sick, or that it's possible to ask the sky for rain if you know the right words.
But even the shortcuts you just offered are shortcuts, because in the book there's an elaborate pattern of how that thought is shaping behavior and what the sort of concentric circles of that thought might be. I mean, was it the process of writing, seeing what was perhaps embedded that was about today versus then, that gradually built an awareness of what that consciousness was? Or did you have do you have some sort of a deeper intuition? I mean, I have questions about your capacity for wonder, which I think is unparalleled amongst the people that I know. And to me, there must be perforce some connection between that capacity for wonder and this ability to inhabit the superstitious, if you will. But it sounds to me like maybe the process was a little bit more gradual than you having an intuition for that way of thinking and then finding the language for it.
I'm sure you have the same experience. Writing means developing an intuition for things. You never have a good intuition when you start on something, but the process of writing, that's one of the reasons why it takes so long. I mean, not always, but often is to write a novel, is because you develop an intuition for the world you're moving in as a storyteller. And the great thing about writing something set in the past, even in the remote past, is that, of course, you can use, and you should use, the research of historians, but you feel historians have very good intuitions, but they, of course, per definition of what they're doing, they have to be very careful about following their intuitions. But you as a writer can just learn from the historians and then invent on the basis of what you think that world was like. So, for example, it's always been a matter in discussion what it meant that most children died, what it meant for the relationship between adults and between people and their children. And the greatest historian on the history of childhood, Philippe Ariès, he's very careful on that question. He doesn't want to make a determination about, does that mean that people love their children less, allowed themselves to love their children less? But I, as a storyteller and as someone on whose book it says novel, I'm free from the constraints a historian is working under. So I can say, yeah, of course, absolutely, it means people didn't allow themselves to love their children to the same extent. Absolutely. So I'm using the research of Philippe Ariès and others, but then I make decisions that they are not allowed to make to the same extent. And while you move in this world and invent and write, then you develop firmer and firmer intuitions. Some of them might actually be wrong. If I would now be a time traveler and I would go to the 17th century, I might be very surprised about a few things. But the point of a novel is plausibility. It's not that it has to be true, but I think a lot of things, I mean, I trust my intuition. I think a lot of things I invent about the world back then are actually true. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But then as a novelist, if you're wrong,
there's no consequence.
Right.
Just to finish the Tyll chapter of our discussion, I read in a piece, I can't remember if it was the Times ran a lovely piece about you on the publication of Tyll, and I think you said that you were 2/3 of the way through Tyll when Trump was elected, and that you had a tough time finishing, but that Tyll helped you finish. You want to say a little bit about that?
Well, the character helped me. I was like many of us. I think I was completely overwhelmed and shocked and mortified, and I felt like the world was changing into something very frightening and dark and terrible under my eyes, and so I stopped writing, and I didn't know how to go on. And then I actually, and that never happened to me before, and I don't expect it ever will happen again, but that's the amazing gift when you work with a mythical character as a writer. When, which Till Eulenspiegel is, I felt you're writing about Till, who's living in the darkest time imaginable, and he's able to always move on. Nothing breaks him. That's the kind of the point of the character. So how do you think Till would react to somebody like Donald Trump? Would he be impressed? He would not be impressed. So don't let yourself don't let yourself be struck down by something like this. Much worse things have happened. Much worse things can happen. So the last you can do is finish your book, and that. So the initial kind of surreal cheerfulness of Till really helped me.
The Napoleonic Wars, we were talking briefly before this event, the Napoleonic Wars are sort of an hors-champ event in measuring the world. And obviously the 30-Year War is part of Till. Your latest book, which may be as ambitious, if not more ambitious than the other two, is set in the Second World War. What is it about war that seems to provoke the deepest levels of your imagination?
I could answer that war is, of course, one of the original incentives of storytelling. Arma virumque cano, I'm thinking of Arms and the Man. Storytelling has not always, but often been about wars. But I also have to say what fascinates me about writing about wars or other kinds of very intense, deep crisis is not to approach them head on. Like, so also my new novel, about which I don't want to say much, but part of it will be set in the Second World War, but it will not be set in the Second World War. So it will be something that happens around the edges of what I'm writing about. And I'm doing something similar. We just talked about that briefly before in Measuring the World, when the Napoleonic Wars are taking place as something that Gauss doesn't notice.
Right.
Because he's not interested. And of course, his whole world changes, but he barely notices. And that is something I find really fascinating, how big history intersects with individual lives, and often it intersects on a very subtle level. Huge things can happen, and the traces you see in an individual life are very small. Of course, sometimes they're huge, but I'm right now I'm really interested in those small traces, if that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense. I brought some of your books, and I had underlined stuff that I was going to read from, but it just feels onerous for me to go and search through that. But there were a lot of passages like that you're describing that I would kept coming back to and underlining and thinking about, and it seemed connected to me again. You know, part of this conversation is filtered through the fact that I know you. And I had an amazing mentor when I was much younger, a Polish director by the name of Jerzy Gotowski, who I spent a fair amount of time with. And one of the things that he said to me was that if you meet somebody who has some ability that you don't have, spend time around them and steal it. And so I spent a lot of time, I mean, I love being around you, but there are things about you that you have that I think, wow, I would love to know how to do that. So in the interest of perhaps, all of us stealing some stuff from you, what's the practice of being Daniel Kehlmann that keeps your wonder sharpened? And if you could maybe talk about your sense of wonder, if you are aware of it, do you have an awareness of that about yourself?
Not too much. I just find the world very confusing, if that's what you mean. And I find
That seems to be exactly what it is, actually.
I find the world very confusing, and I'm often the thing, and I think this is why I write about history, or why I've not about. I said I'm not going to use that word. Why I set some of my books in the historical past is because I often feel it's strange how we take everything for granted just because it happens in the present. So, well, the easiest example is historical clothes. We look at pictures of the 17th, the 18th century. We feel like, how did people live with these strange clothes? I often look at us and I feel, how do we live with these strange clothes? And there are so many things we feel like we get used to the world we are in. We get used to the life we live, and we don't see anymore how strange it is. And then a few years later, even looking back on our own life, which has become historical at that point, we feel like, oh, that was very strange. I mean, you all know this kind of, to something very silly, but that feels like to the point. There are those television formats where they invite people who are very famous and they show them pictures from their early 20s, and then they always are shocked about their stupid haircuts and stupid clothes. And I feel like, but in 5 years you will be shocked about the way you look now. But for most people, whatever happens now seems just beyond anything you could be surprised or astonished about, just because it is now. And that is something I could never share. And I'm always surprised by everything that happens now, or by a lot. And I think that's what brought me to write, to set novels in the past.
It's interesting you say being confused. That makes, I was one of the passages that I underlined was in the book about the screenwriter who basically, loses it.
Yeah.
And he's reading a story to his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a story about the bears and how the bears are so happy that the humans have succeeded. And there's some there's some contradiction, and the narrator basically says, I couldn't understand why the bears cared what the people thought, right? And
it's a very silly children's book that I invented because I hate a lot of children's books.
But it seemed it was a paradigmatic maneuver in your fiction, where you would comment on something that was evidently absurd, but rather than mocking it, or rather than coming to some conclusion about it, or rather than being embittered by the fact that humanity seems so endlessly stupid, you simply state it, play it to sometimes you play it for comedy.
Yeah, I do.
But then it becomes a kind of open gesture. You just keep staying in that confusion.
And I'm not quite able to do that in my daily life. So I'm not quite the same person in daily life as I am as a writer, because I do get very impatient with a lot of stuff that happens, and a lot of things I find stupid or idiotic or unbearable when just as the person I am. But I feel like as a writer, that you should never do that while you are a writer writing. As a writer, you have to, at least you should not be upset. You should. There's a great line by V.S. Naipaul. Good literature, or great literature, he says, is a disturbing vision presented from a position of strength. And I think that's a great remark, especially if you really don't feel you are in a position of strength, but you have to kind of behave like you do while you're writing.
That Naipaul quote reminds me of a Gramsci quote: "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will."
Yes.
Right. Same idea. Oh, God, I had a question that just leapt out of my mind. I want to talk a little bit about the theater, because that's where I apply much of my trade. And so tell me about your experience of writing for the theater, which I guess is a way of saying, tell me a little bit about your dad to start with.
Yeah, my father was a director for television and theater, and I spent a lot of time in my childhood in the theater or around the theater. And when I started writing, I saw myself as a prose writer, and I think it was a natural way of staying away from what I felt like was my father's world. And after Measuring the World became very successful, I've decided that success also means, or mostly means, that you're free to try other things. And my father sadly wasn't alive anymore, so that might also have played a role in me starting to write for the theater. And it has been such an amazing and enjoyable adventure for me. I still feel like I'm mostly and utterly a prose writer, so that's what I really am. But I love to explore other forms, and I think, and I mean, you know so much more about this than I do. The great thing about writing for actors is that when you're lucky and when they're good actors, they can turn your writing into something more powerful, more subtle, and better than it is on the page. And
You can do the opposite too.
of course, that's what usually happens, but not always. And and when it happens, when they turn it into something better and more powerful, that's just an amazing experience. So just for I'm mostly doing it for that experience, which is rare. Mostly it's not what happens.
I'm remembering the thing that I sort of slipped out of my mind, but it fits in this moment because I think of another writer of prose who was, of course, an extraordinary dramatist in an unusual way, Beckett, who's the only other writer I can think of who moves that confusion, that ontological confusion, from the background to the foreground in the way that I think you still have story, unlike some of Beckett's stories. Is there some connection? Do you?
Yes, he's a great influence. He's very important to me, not just in a general sense, but in Tyll. In several moments of the book, of writing the novel, I thought of Beckett explicitly as a model for what I was doing. More than mostly, but not only, but more than anywhere else in the chapter called "In the Shaft," where Tyll and two soldiers are buried during the siege of Brno in a shaft, in a collapsed shaft. And that's also an example of how I feel like I wanted to write about war, because I started out thinking about writing about a big siege and about siege warfare. And then I decided to leave out everything except the distant noise and just have three people locked together in the dark. And then you're naturally in a Beckett situation. And so the whole chapter is just those three voices. And in the dark while they hear the shells exploding. And I'm still trying to get some sort of comedy out of that terrible situation. And for that, Beckett was explicitly a model. Or whenever I write dialogue, Beckett is kind of one of the main models. People talking to each other, not understanding each other. Also, Beckett has a wonderful way of characters. I'm talking especially about the Beckett of Molloy. That's my favorite, because, as you said, there is still some story. I personally prefer the Beckett of Molloy to the Beckett of the Nameless, and the later. I also love Crab's Last Tape would actually be my favorite play, and then more than the late one-act plays where actually the humor somehow gets lost in the experiment. But he has such a wonderful way of in his fiction, his narrative fiction, kind of narrative fiction, about people making a statement and then thinking exactly the opposite of what they just said. And it's whenever he does that, it's just unbelievably not funny, but also very acute psychologically. And that's something, for example, I do a lot. So I wouldn't be the same writer without Beckett.
So continuing on this theme of the theater, I have had the good fortune in the past few years of working in Germany in the theater quite a bit and encountering some really wonderful people. A very famous director who will remain nameless. I mentioned that we were friends, and she said, "Oh, he's a very strange guy, isn't he?" And I sort of inquired, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, that speech he gave in Salzburg." "What speech did you give in Salzburg?"
I gave a speech that was not very aggressive or very polemical, but but a little bit. But that was enough to really cause some upset in the German theater world, in which I said I would love it if plays would be directed the way they were written. Which doesn't seem like a very controversial statement, except if you well, you know the German theater well, so you know it's a controversial statement in the circumstances of the German theater. It's not a very controversial statement anywhere else. But what's important to me, we just talked about Beckett. Beckett is someone who kept interfering if he felt a production strayed too much from the way he had written it. So no matter how you stand on this topic, it's not something about... so in Germany, there's firmly the idea that anything experimental or avant-garde has to be done by the director. And so if you interfere with that, you have a conservative idea of culture. And that's something I deeply disagree with. I just think the avant-garde should be done by the writer. Yeah, but that's the fun. I mean, the speech that was in 2009, so there was, my God, 13 years ago.
Yeah, and this was like 11 years. This is like 11 years later that this person said.
Yeah, there are lots of theaters who still refuse to even consider my plays because of that speech I gave 13 years ago, because they think I'm a really evil person. But that's fine. That's I'm not feeling. I'm not turning this into a free speech issue or whatever. It's just I also don't think German theater will change anytime soon. I've made my peace with that. I've made a film now with my friend Daniel Brühl, who directed it, and it was an idea we had together, and we wrote some of it together. And you've seen it. The film is like the film. Thank you. The film is like a lot of that film is like a play. So when you...
Actually, Annika and I, when we saw it,
Yeah.
I thought it was a play that I didn't know
Yeah.
about, that you had adapted, because it was contained and...
Yeah, it's that was the idea. The idea was when you can get the theaters to do the play exactly like you want, and you have to make a film. Then you can actually control what it looks like.
Do you mind if we stay on this beat for a second about the German theater? What is the... Why is it so... director? I mean, it's interesting. My experiences working there have been very, very positive. I think you said to me at one point, every few years there's somebody who breaks through, always a foreigner, somebody who's not German, who gets to tell stories in the theater.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, it seemed like for a particular time that was me.
Yeah. So
I had different experiences in a way of working, but I have noticed the frustration that writers that I have met there of the theater have. This is a very, very common thing that is said. What is it about the German theater that is so director focused? Why is that the case?
The wonderful German playwright Theresia Walser wrote that if you want to have a table in a certain scene on stage, there's only one way to make sure you get that table, which is to say in the direction, there cannot be a table on stage. So just to say about, so I'm not the only one who feels strongly about this. I think I think the problem for me, what I see as the problem at the core of this, is that it's a deep distrust in language. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm really trying to analyze it without being negative about it. It's at the core of it is the idea that language is something boring and dead, and that the art and anything that's interesting about a performance has to be created by the performer in a strong performative way, but that you have to get the language out of the way. And And yeah, that's something I deeply disagree with. If I would be a director, which I never would, because I never will be, but if I would be a theater director, I would go the opposite way. I would be very minimalistic, and I would just have very good actors present the language as fully and perfectly as possible, and hold back as much as on anything else. I'm not saying that's the only way to do theater. I'm saying that would be my preference.
Well, what's so interesting about what you're saying, in my experience, because I find that the work that I've done has been it's very language focused,
Mm-hmm.
and American actors have difficulty with it.
Yeah.
And the productions I've seen in Germany have been much better because the actors are so good with text,
Mm-hmm.
which is such a paradox.
It is a paradox.
Because,
No, we have
because you're
wonderful
right. Well, I
actors,
hear
yeah.
what you're saying,
Yeah.
but yet the German schools are teaching German actors to work with text better than anybody on the planet.
They're still doing that. Yes, yes. It is a paradox, of course. And I'm not saying everything is terrible. I'm just yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up old resentments.
No, I'm not on my part. No resentment on my part.
Wow.
I had a friend
on my
of
part on behalf of you.
a friend of mine who's a comedian. He read my speech, that old speech, just a few years ago, because he said, people mention it all the time, can you send it to me? And then he read it and he said, my God, if I, meaning himself, said, if I get hired to open a meeting of chocolate manufacturers, I make more aggressive jokes about chocolate manufacturers than you made about the theater. This is what caused the whole thing. He couldn't believe it. So it's really, it's a very, if you read it now, after hearing what we said, all we said, you will find it's a very mildly critical speech, nothing else.
And the writer-director relationship is always a power struggle, and it
has to be. Yeah.
In Germany, that struggle has been decided
Yeah.
in the courts
Yes.
on the side of the director. Right? So here's my last question. I don't have no idea how long we've gone, so I'm gonna call it now because I know there's no Q&A, official Q&A. Tell me about the difference. You spent a lot of time in New York. You understand this country pretty well. You've spent a lot of time here. You love it here.
Doesn't feel like I understand it, but I'm trying.
Right, but you do. You do. And you obviously, Germany is your home. Tell me the difference between the two cultures from a writer's point of view in terms of their relationship to literature or the production of literature, your friends who are American writers, your friends who are German writers. Are there some sort of larger perspective things you could say? There
is one thing that always strikes me as very, as something I notice right away whenever I change between the two cultures. Writers in Europe, especially in Germany, I hear also in some Eastern European countries, but I don't know them well enough, but writers are really, they get a lot of respect. They are taken very, very serious. Somehow it's still the idea that the writer is kind of in the center of culture. As a writer, you get invited onto the television primetime news to say something about whatever happens. You feel like you occupy a very central part in the culture. And I'm not sure that's good. So I'm not saying this is great compared to it is good, of course. It's good because it makes you feel great as a writer, but I often feel American writers are, or have over the last 30 years, have produced more interesting work from much more marginalized position. So I feel, in a way, maybe the writer's position should be marginal. And being, I've read a lot of Kafka recently, so maybe this shows in what I'm saying here. But maybe the being as marginal as possible would be the writer's ideal position of strength, to quote Naples again. And but of course, you feel much better as a writer if you're less marginalized. But maybe you write better if you don't feel as good about yourself being a writer. But that's just very tentative.
So internalizing that observation,
yeah,
and recognizing that there may be some truth for you to glean from it,
yeah,
for your own practice.
Yeah.
What do you do to self-marginalize, if anything?
Well, I lived in America.
And on that note, folks, I give you Daniel Kehlmann.
Honored guests, the awardee, Daniel Kehlmann. I would just like to render a personal encomium, one that tells the story how Daniel affected me via his writing, especially by some of his characters. First, there's the figure of Gauss in Die Vermessung der Welt. Gauss, as you know, revolutionized the shape of space via his non-Euclidean geometry that rendered space curved, not flat. Although a lot of people still think everything is flat, but another story. This led to the notion of the positive curvature of space, that is the spherical model of the universe, in which the beginning is the end, and the end is a new beginning. How did it affect me, this figure of Gauss, in my own work, my own research? Thinking here, as some of you may have guessed, of Nietzsche, who also adopts the spherical model of the universe. Thinking here of doubleness, of somehow the idea that every, again, beginning is an end, and every end is a beginning. He develops this, in my view, into what I would call, only testing here, Nietzsche's theory of the eternal new beginning, unending new beginnings. There is no death that doesn't, or no destruction that doesn't bring about a new beginning. By destruction, I don't mean human destruction, but the natural decay and eventual death of everything that, via some transformation, leads to a new beginning. So Gauss alone, the very figure, stimulated me in thinking again about this notion of a universe that never ends, always starts over anew. Then, of course, there is Tyll Eulenspiegel. Here again, I would want to say that Tyll is the figure that somehow allows us to mix or suspend binary opposition. I was thinking when I first heard about Tyll, I've read it since then, but I was thinking about the story of Tyll Eulenspiegel, walking up the hill and feeling not badly about the idea that this was an effort that caused him some pain, but as the story goes, he knew that after the climbing and the work that had to be expended, there would be the Abstieg. And that made him look forward to the eventual Abstieg, up, down. However, when he was on the Abstieg, he sooner or later adopted again the idea that he would have to face the next Aufstieg and the travail that is associated with that. So the question that was posed to Tyll, if I could lapse into German here, wie kannst du lachen und fröhlich sein, wenn es so steil und anstrengend bergauf geht, dass es einem die Puste nimmt, wollen die Leute von Tyll wissen. Mit einem breiten Lachen im Gesicht erklärt ihnen der Eulenspiegel seine Sicht der Dinge. Jetzt, wo es bergauf geht, bin ich fröhlich, weil ich weiß, dass es nachher wieder bergab geht. Und darauf freue ich mich schon. Nachher aber, wenn ich den Berg herunterlaufe, wird meine Laune schlechter, denn ich weiß, der nächste Berg wartet und dann muss ich mich wieder anstrengen. What gave me a new idea, again relating to Nietzsche, is that all binary oppositions are human constructs that insist on strict division between, let's say, anstrengend und leicht. For Nietzsche, this suspension of binary oppositions, which in my view Eulenspiegel engages in, is something very important. In other words, the suspension of binary oppositions and resorting to something that is both and, which for Nietzsche is the truth, as he says already in The Birth of Tragedy, excess, by which he means suspension of binary opposition thinking is the truth. So this is how I was affected by Daniel's writing, and I would just add, in concluding, in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined when I arrived in New York on October 15, 1951, just 3 days of my 70th birthday, that I would be standing here tonight, 70 years later, to celebrate and honor one of the most illustrious German writers of our time, Daniel Kehlmann. Daniel, I honor you and appreciate you. Glad you're here, healthy and hardy. We hope that will continue for a long time. Thank you very much. So Daniel, it is my honor and pleasure to give you this award.
Thank you.
And I usually say the check is in the mail, but I think we do indeed have it. Do we? Oh, okay. It's in the mail. But anyway, it's really a pleasure.
Don't worry, I'm not giving a speech. I'll just say thank you so much. This means so much to me. Thank you, Fred. Thank you for your generosity. Also, thank you for coming to my seminar back then when I was teaching it. That meant the world to me. And yes, thank you to the whole German department for the wonderful discussions I had here, for the years I was allowed to have a home in New York in this wonderful department, and it means so. The collaboration meant so much to me, and this is just the crowning moment of this. I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you.
Fred, it is my honor to say happy birthday to you, and of course to thank you for this prize and for this event. And I would like to wrap up this beautiful event with a little time travel, if you will travel with me to February 21st, 2013. Does anybody remember what event took place during that day? I would be surprised, but it was somewhere in Soho, and it was another event that brought together Daniel and Fred. And I would like to quote from a speech that Daniel gave that night, if I may, and then I will tell you what the event was, where another prize was awarded. So I'm quoting Daniel. There are so many people who would love to receive prizes. And then he jokingly continued, I might be one of them. I know what I'm talking about. But there are very, very, very few people who are capable and idealistic enough to put their money on the line to bankroll those prizes. Fred is one of them, and I'm deeply impressed by his generosity. And now some of you will remember, because some of you who were there, I know Uli, you were there, you guys were there, I don't know, Eric, maybe you were there, I mean, maybe other people from the German department were there, but it was the inaugural Friedrich ULFERS Prize that was awarded at the beginning of our Festival Neue Literatur, and it was awarded to the late translator and publisher Carol Brown Janeway. And Daniel gave the laudation, a beautiful speech in praise of translation for Carol. And, you know, of course, many of you know that Carol translated all of Daniel's books until she passed away. Anyway, I revisited that event and found that quote, and I'm so glad that we've like a Kreis geschlagen, and I'm not quite sure how to translate that, how we are connecting from 2013 from another beautiful award ceremony and connecting the two, coming here. And in the meantime, of course, from a moment of personal reflection, and Deutsches Haus and I personally have been so lucky to work together with the German department and the New York Institute for the Humanities, with Eric, with Uli, with Fred, with Daniel, with so many of you from the German department here. And I'm so glad this brings us together, and to have these people who've been regulars at Deutsches Haus and have supported us. And you have brought like AI storytelling, the magicians, Mark Mitten. We've had a conversation about what is a feuilleton. We've discussed F. We've discussed You Should Have Left. We've discussed with Jonathan Franzen and you and Paul Ryder. We've discussed the Kraus Project. I mean, I think within the past 9 years, pretty much every year, we've had an event with you, and I hope this will continue. And we've already talked about an event for next year, which I'm not going to go into, but thank you so much, Fred. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, the German department. I also want to give a big shout out to Lindsay and Hinna and Drew and Sarah, who worked on this event in particular. But this collaboration across the departments and with the other institutions, and I'm sorry, Eric, that you are now no longer part of NYU, but we keep working together, and I'm so glad you're all here. It's a wonderful group. I'm so happy to see you all in person, even though I'm now completely zoomed in and I do all my thinking is in Zoom, but it is strangely invigorating to see you all in person, and that makes me happy. And thank you for coming. Thank you for all the great books. Thank you for all the great prizes. Thank you, Uli, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of the evening. And say one more time, herzlichen Glückwunsch zum Geburtstag, lieber Fred, alles Gute und auf ein neues. Thank you. Thank you.